Uh, Aldous Huxley was anti-colonial, uh, bitterly anti-colonial, and so is bitterly opposed to Rudyard Kipling. We will bring Kipling also into the discussion later on, which I should quickly jot down. And Huxley said some very interesting, innocent things, but which are very useful to understand in today's context. After touring India, Huxley came to the conclusion, and he said that he wants to, if he had £5 billion, he would give it to Atheist Society of India because he thought that religion is the root trouble of India, and which is why Indians are able to overthrow um, uh, the British. Of course, in a turn of events, Huxley later on would turn to spirituality and Buddhism and trying out psychedelic drugs and so on and so forth. So that's Huxley's later life. But at this point of time, and why he said that is because he could not understand as to why this minuscule population of British were able to control this huge mass with its diversity. And so he advocated what he advocated, and he says several things. He says that the colonizer makes the colonized feel so inferior, and which was done systematically in India's case with Macaulay's Minutes, which I'm sure everybody here knows about, where Macaulay said that one shelf of British books is has more knowledge than all of the body of work combined in India, and so on and so forth, and and also to create English knowledge system, um, uh, and so that the subjects can get civilized under the scheme of white man's burden, fulfill, sort of unburden the white man's burden, and so on. And so Aldous Huxley says that the colonizer makes the colonized feel so inferior that they have to uh, reformulate their masculinity, to reformulate their identity. They have to hark back to a golden past, to an imagined golden past. And so it was in 1920s also people were talking about plastic surgery of Ganesha, or missiles that were fired during Ramayana and Mahabharata and so on and so forth. And so it's not an ingenious trick that is being employed in 2020. It was this trick was very much being played 100 years ago as well, and in 100 years nobody has found those texts uh, about building missiles and flying rockets in any of the Indian texts. And so Huxley was to the point. And of course, he's naive in his assumption that you root out religion and you get. Of course, he would also have been influenced by the Bolshevik Revolution at that point of time. But he's also bitterly critical of the communists in the Brave New World. Um, so that is Aldous Huxley. And now coming to two seminal texts quickly, which everybody does talk about while discussing post-colonialism. One is Edward Said's Orientalism from 1978, which was sort of path-breaking at that point of time, and what would appear as common sense today. And so one can imagine how deeply sort of a colonial mindset was entrenched um, in the former colonies as well, to consider this work path-breaking, because he simply through a survey tells that the Occident created the Orient, and largely his work is about the Middle East. He talks a little bit about India as well, and how the Middle East, being the cradle of civilization, how Occident or the West, in its imagination, in its complex of dealing with, in colonizing its originator, created the image of others, the exotic others, where there are all sorts of exotic images that were created um, uh, of lascivious women, of snake charmers and elephants in India, and so on. So these stock images which were produced again and again and again. Now, in my book, I have uh, said an interesting thing, which is that Dickens wrote a lot about India. And so Dickens and John Lang, who lived in India, um, they had they met at a party where they cracked a lot of jokes, Indian jokes, and told each other Indian anecdotes and so on. And John Lang, at the end of the party, finds out that Charles Dickens had never been to India, and still he was able to regale his audiences with all the stories of elephants and snake charmers and so on and so forth. And so Edward Said says that this was a systematic form of writing, a genre of writing which developed over a period of time, over a century, where these kind of stock images of cannibalism, etc., were again and again reproduced in various representations of the other of the Orient. And so, for Edward Said, it's Orientalism is nowhere near the Orient. It's an image, it's an imagination that is created for the Occident. Developing on Said's work is Homi Bhabha's work. It's a body of several essays where he talks about man and mimicry and hybridity and so on and so forth. And there are other scholars like James Clifford, etc. And also Ashish Nandi talks a lot about this. uh, does respond to the idea of the ideas of Homi Bhabha. See, the few key ideas of Homi Bhabha very quickly to get them aside, and then we can have a discussion about some literary works and how they theoretically fit into these ideas. So one idea of Homi Bhabha is mimicry. Now, mimicry, as we understand it in common parlance, is making fun of someone by imitating them. So, in all of Homi Bhabha's terminology, in fact, all of this post-colonial theory, these words are double-edged swords where they mean from the other side as well. And so, of course, there is that mimicry of the colonizer by the colonizer of the colonized, uh, by cultural appropriation, to make fun, like we make fun by mimicking somebody's accent, which was mimicking the accent has always been happening, still happens. But in Homi Bhabha, he is seeing it from the other side, which is that the colonial subject mimics the colonizer. And this is the age old classical uh, idea of mimesis, where we learn things by mimesis. And so once the colonizing culture has a sort of subjugated um, a culture, then the next step is to make them feel inferior about their culture, about their texts, about their literature, and so on and so forth, and then introduce uh, their civilizational values, their cultural values into the culture, which would only be a mimesis, which would only be a mimicry. So in this case, the brown sahibs or the Calcutta clerks, as the British terms, the clerks and the Calcutta coolies and so on and so forth. So this Babudam that emerged in Calcutta at first, and later this whole culture of designating Rai Bahadurs and so on and so forth, where the brown sahibs were more sahibs than the sahibs, and which is true of post-colonial India as well, is an attempt to mimic the English, and therefore they would always feel inferior to the colonizing culture. Now, all of Homi Bhabha's ideas are ideas of hybridity, of how it is not only a one-way transaction, but the transaction happens both ways, and it therefore profoundly affects the colonizer as well, uh, which is the case in anthropology as well. Anthropology, as a discipline, was founded, as the word suggests, anthropos plus logos, is a study of human beings, and therefore the colonizers trying to study various kinds of human beings across colonies. This is why this discipline was said. And Amitav Ghosh's very interesting fieldwork diary, which became a book in an antique land, talks about this in detail, about how the gaze of the observer, of the student, is not the only gaze. It's the gaze that the field also throws upon him, the subject also throws upon, the object of the study also throws their gaze back upon uh, the observer. So in an antique land, Amitabh Ghosh, for example, in his field trip in Egypt, says that there's this man who asks him, he's very curious about Hindus and asks him how they dispose of the dead, and he says, we burn the dead, and the Imam, so it's called the Imam in the Indian, this piece, uh, is horrified because in Islamic culture, obviously, burning is related with hell, which goes up. And he also asks him if he cuts his pubic hair. And Amitabh Ghosh, the narrator, let's say, not Amitabh Ghosh, the narrator says no, and he looks down at his trousers, imagining that his pubic hair would have grown out of his trousers, something like that. And eventually, this whole funny transaction goes on between them, and eventually they both lose it, and they start talking about who has more sophisticated weapons, and so one says we have these kind of missiles, and the other says we have these kind, and so on and so forth, until the narrator says, oh, we have a nuclear bomb. And in the end, the writer steps in between the conversation of this narrator and the Imam and says, here we were, vestiges of ancient civilization. I don't know the exact word, you can look it up. Vestiges of ancient civilization vying for modernity through violence of the West. And so, violence of the West is what the post colonial situation has inherited and competes through that, and which was the logic of the Cold War, which is why many countries were partitioned and left by the ex-colonizers for the trouble to brew, like between India and Pakistan. A very good example is also Tunisia and Algeria, where Tunisia is a much smaller country than Algeria. Uh, but the Tunisian ruler gave away the disputed land to Algeria and said, we want the colonizers' burden of our back. So that's a very interesting decolonizing sort of strategy, which with Arab Spring has taken another dimension now. And so, coming back to Homi Bhabha, this mimicry is the colonized society, we trying to mimic the British, and it reaches a situation where parents are proud that the children are monolingual in English and not know Hindi or regional languages and so on and so forth. And on the other hand, the other game also plays where the government insists on imparting vernacular language education to a certain class, and so that sort of a status quo is maintained. And that is as much post-colonialism as negotiating with the English language also is. So, in terms of mimicry, Baba's idea is this situation where the colonized is trying to mimic the colonizer, and therefore, assumption of the colonizer is that the mimicry would be unsuccessful. So you're asking a tennis player to play cricket. The assumption is that he'll be unsuccessful. But what often happens through this the crack in the wall that lets the light in is that there are people who are successful as well when the tennis players successfully start playing cricket. And so uh, mimicry is a positive force for Bhava, where the colonized is able to deconstruct the power structure by entering the game of the colonizer, by being equally able to do that. And so it's not just a negative force. And all his ideas, all the other words, the other terms that I mentioned, are filled with a similar idea of hybridity. So there's ambivalence where the colonizer looks at the colonized through a colonial gaze uh, of this civilization as inferior, and therefore amenable to being civilized by the white man's burden, and an exotic, where there are these beautiful women and elephants and so on and so forth, the exact exotic imagination, and cannibalism, as you mentioned. Um, And on the other hand, the colonized subject sees the colonizer as superior, civilized, but corrupt. And so it is this ambivalence. So while this inferiority is injected into the culture, uh, the, the idea of corruption makes the subjugated uh, country strike back, as also in the case of India. And so this ambivalence also is a hybrid position, according to Bhabha, which happens. Then there's appropriation where the where the colonizer would appropriate cultural artifacts of the colonized space. So for example, right now, a museumization of tribals or a display of Jarwar tribes in Andaman would all be appropriation. And for Bhabha, the appropriation also happening the other way around, that the colonized subject tries to appropriate the colonizer's language. So we try to speak Queen's English well, or now American English, watching um, all the American television content and OTT platforms and so on and so forth. And this appropriation also for Homi Baba can be a positive force because it can rupture, let's say, which has happened very successfully in the case of African novels with Chinua Achebe or Mugi Thiongo or Amos Tutuola, who wrote a novel called Palm Wine Drinker, not drunkard, but drinker. And he uses colloquialisms of English and the very way in which Africans speak English. Uh, and there's been movement in African literature as also Afro-American literature. And so there's a sort of cultural appropriation of English, so much so that the reverse starts happening, for which also there's a term which I'm forgetting right now, where white people would try to sound cool by um, appropriating reggae or hip hop or dressing up like black people, and so on and so forth. And the last term that is often used with Bhabha is abrogation. And abrogation is something which various African scholars took, which means is you dump the colonizer's burden, which of course isn't quite possible. And so Rugi Thiongo as well as Chin Wei Zhu in decolonizing the African mind and Rugi Thiongo in decolonizing the mind, talk of abrogation, of relinquishing English language and English customs and the colonizers' burden and reinventing, rediscovering their own culture. Back home, Namvar Singh has written about decolonizing the Indian mind, where he talks about similar concerns. He talks about hegemony in literature, and he says that it's heartening that Indian literature is able to free itself from the shackles of British literature. This essay is also nearly 40 years old, or even more. That we are not merely copying, let's say, the European tradition of social realism, modernism, and so on and so forth, that we have our own cultural artifacts by invoking our own kind of realism, by invoking uh, mythology, our sense of history, and so on and so forth. Uh, and so there has been a lot of discussion um, in terms of the strategies to decolonize. And Homi Bhabha has sort of formed an amalgamation of all these ideas in various directions. And his idea is that it's somewhere in between, that these are hybrid structures. And they inform from both sides that it's not that simple. It's not in black and white. Ashish Nandi has some interesting points in The Intimate Enemy, Loss of Recovery and Self, which is also nearly 40 years old from 1983, where interestingly he uses the word innocence at the beginning of the book. So while Said says, so his book is 5 years after Said, So while Said says that this is a design, that there is the cultural appropriation and domination of the Orient, and this creation of this cannibalistic, snake charming East was created systematically over a period of 100 years or more, um, is sort of contested by Ashish Nandi. And we'll come back to Said and Darwin in a bit. And Nandi says that it's actually innocent, that there's not so much design as maybe earnestness as well of the Enlightenment era, that there were really earnest priests who came in who really believed that Jesus would save the world, and who, in the earnest, with all their sincerity, went about their missions. And there would have been several journalists of people in the military also through their serving relation, and so on. And so uh, that innocent sort of colonialism is more dangerous than the calculated design one. And Nandi says that, like Baba, he says that it, this innocence does not run just for the colonizer, but for the colonized as well. And we, in our innocence, uh, while we were talking of ambivalence of the colonized having this sense of inferiority, but at the same time believing that the colonizer is corrupt. And so we also, in our innocence, were able to throw out. And this is what Nandi believes, that people may talk about the forces of history, and that the colonial powers had to abrogate because the economy had completely collapsed after the Second World War, and so on. But Nandi contends that it is this innocence which created colonization as well as decolonization. The freedom struggle was also innocent in certain ways, and colonization was also innocent in certain ways. Nandi also brings in Mahatma Gandhi as a central figure amongst various other figures in this uh, work, and talks about the Hind Swaraj, where Gandhi sort of probes as to why we were colonized. Something that Chinua Achebe does very well in Things Fall Apart as well. And Gandhi's idea is that we were seduced by the glitter of materialism. So Gandhi sort of divided it between the East and the West. So he was also creating uh, his Occident, and therefore his entire persona, his entire eccentricity, which manifest in a certain way. Gandhi believed that we were seduced, and which is the same idea that comes down from Gramsci and Althusser, the idea of consensual, the consent to power, what Althusser calls interpellation, that we are interpellated into power structures, we are interpellated into consumerism, and similar ideas. And similarly, Gandhi believed that we were seduced by this whole material culture, something that Tagore also endorses, that East is the cradle of spirituality and West of materialism. And so it's very interesting. Nandi also goes on to talk about Gandhi's assassination, Nathuram Godse's testimony in the court. The Nathuram Godse does not really say that, amongst other things, he may have said that Gandhi was playing into the hands of Muslims, therefore he killed him. But amongst other things, he also said that Gandhi is an effeminate man, a man unfit to be called the father of the nation, and which is why it was important to kill him. Now, it's very important to go into Nathuram Godse's own background over here. His name is Nathuram because he wore a nut or a nose ring, and because an astrologer had told his father, after the death of uh, children in succession, that a boy child cannot survive in your household, and only if a girl is born will she survive. So Nathuram was born, and so he was given a nose ring to hoodwink destiny that he's a girl, and so he was brought up as a girl in his initial years. And so he was trying to prove his masculinity much more uh, uh, than Gandhi being an effeminate figure. And so this anxiety led him to kill Gandhi. This very interesting tidbit from history, and which also throws light upon uh, aggression in general, violent strategies of how it could be coming from what Milan Kundera calls ethos in his book of Laughter and Forgetting, our own inadequacy, which makes us violent towards those who are able to achieve it. Ashish Nandi has a different take on this matter and about the colonial situation. And he goes on to say in this book that this whole idea of Western masculinity and therefore they emasculated the Bengali Babu, so to say, as Bengal was the first place to be brought into the fold of colonial time and colonial work ethos, etc. And so the ethos that existed over here in India from our mythology of Ardhanarishwar, of Shiva, that is half man, half woman, and that is uh, God himself, and so on and so forth. So he says that this culture was destroyed by the British. And of course, Nandi's theory can be, of course, contested variously. We were deep in the muck of sati and various malpractices of female feticide, etc. And so to assume that we were Shakti worshippers or Arjunarishwar worshippers, it may be theoretically may have some credence, but pragmatically, what was happening on the ground, there seems to be very little proof of this. And so Nandi's thesis also has to be taken with a pinch of salt. And of course, colonization, we're talking here, he's falling into the trap of uh, colonization only in terms of Western colonization. Is unable to see the feudal colonization or the patriarchal colonization that already was there, colonization of aborigines, etc. Now, this is roughly the critical theories and debates around post-colonialism in the last 30 odd years. And they're very interesting texts, texts in literature as well. And several writers who have also said um, very interesting things. I'd like to point out a couple of things vis-a-vis what we have talked about. So, for example, Gabriel Garcia Marquez got the Nobel in the 70s, um, and what was in Spanish called realismo marveloso, realism which is marvelous, was translated to magic realism in English. Marvelous is nowhere near magic, and that word stuck, and that's the word that stuck with us. That he writes novels in the tradition of the realistic tradition of 19th century, which would appear like very simulacrum, but it would have outrageous elements in it, despite the manner of writing being like that. So, for example, a girl who's buried, her hair is 50 feet long because after death, because her soul is not satisfied, um, her hair is growing at an inch and a day, and so on and so forth. But it's written in the manner of realism. And so Marquez was asked, "How did you come up with this? How did you come up with magic realism?" And he said, "It may be magic for you, Western people. It is realism for us. This is what happens in my country every day, and these are the dates that we hear. And so our sense of narrative is not your sense of narrative. That we have a different sense of narrative, and that the violence of Latin America is entirely inherited." From the violence of Europe, that Europe in its Middle Ages was so violent after all the internal conflicts for 300 or 400 years. Now that Europe is stabilized, you were trying this trick of cultural appropriation by calling it magic realism. It's only mimesis, it's only mimicry. Um, Another important writer for us is, of course, Salman Rushdie. He employs the same sort of device in Midnight Children. I'll not talk about that, and rather talk about Amitabh Ghosh. And Shadow Lines was hailed as a path-breaking novel because of its techniques of disrupting time, broken narrative, combining uh, memory with history and so on and so forth. However, uh, one has to also see uh, these post-colonial scholars in a different light, which is why I'm trying to point out the different strands. That it's the body of theory takes various kinds of ideology into its fold. So while Amitabh Ghosh does talk about memory and history. So, for example, he talks about 1963 riots as the most important event for him in 20th century Indian history, and he shows through archives his personal trauma and how history kind of subsumes memory and so on and so forth. At the same time, if we analyze Amitabh Ghosh's novels, uh, it's full of Bhadralok Bengal. There are caste Bengalis in it. In even Calcutta, which has only about half the population as Bengali, has all the Chinese and Anglo-Indians, Biharis, Marwaris, and everybody else missing. Which Ghosh said it's the writer's prerogative to write from the location that he'd like to. Of course, it's his prerogative, but as a subalternist, though he doesn't like that tag, but as a writer of trying to write history from below, uh, there is a certain responsibility, and so there's a sort of alter colonization happening within that as well. And the most stark work of Amitabh Ghosh for me in this matter is The Hungry Tide, where there's this girl Pia who's a cetologist who researches on dolphins, and she comes to India and she gets help from a fisherman, a machwara, who's married, and there's a guy from the call center, so he's brought in all elements of the modern middle class. Let's say it's 2006 now, and so all these dynamics between these characters keep happening, and he brings out the anti-Naxal massacre in the 1970s, the Mori Chapi massacre, etc. But at the end of the novel, uh, there's a storm in which Pia and the fisherman, Fakir, so it's interesting that it's an upper caste Hindu woman and a lower caste Muslim man, and there's a sort of chemistry building between them. There's a storm, and Fakir dies holding her on a tree, preventing her from the storm. So it's quite a Bollywood ending where he did not know how to deal with this situation really, and that's where sort of uh, the Bhadralok subconscious emerges, and that is sort of a revealing work of Amitabh Ghosh. So, well, I can go on and on, but I think I've taken up a lot of time, so we can um, maybe have a discussion and quickly also talk about my book and vis-a-vis these concepts.
Uh, Thank you, Dr. Ranjan. I think there's a comment from Amrit. He says that the talk got progressively more and more gripping. Thank you, Dr. Ranjan. And I too feel that I would like this talk to go on endlessly, but that's not possible. Um, Instead of those banal definitions, you really made it engaging and interesting with your riveting stories and incidents. And I really want to know more about your book. Uh, I have a book description, and it's so interesting that I would like to know more. So John Lang, first of all, congratulations.
Thanks a lot.
John Lang in inebriated on John Exo, which is a cognag. Most of his adult life was a dogged underdog from Sydney. He spared no effort to hurt the John Company, East India Company. He lived in India after the age of 26 and was a prolific writer, journalist, and lawyer. We'll know more from the writer himself. So, Dr.
Thanks a lot. I'm sort of doing this talk ad hoc. I didn't have the keys to my house, left it in my office, so I'm doing it from a friend's place. So I don't have the book to show you, but it's called. If you Google it, it'll come up. It's called John Lang. It's called longish title: Wanderer of Hindustan, Slanderer in Hindustani, Lawyer for the Rani. And I mean all the three things. He did wander a lot of the upper provinces, up from Calcutta until Delhi. He pretty much knew the area very well. Slanderer in Hindustani. So John Lang lived in India between 1842 and 64. He was an Australian, so Australia did not exist at that point of time as a country, but as a colony. And uh, I'm really sorry that I missed out on talking about Australian colonialism and post-colonialism, which is one of the most important things to talk about. But very briefly, John Lang ke bahane se, the Australian Aboriginal civilization was a continuous civilization for 40,000 years, and which was disrupted in 1788 by Captain Cook and his ship Endeavour. And so Australia is said to have only 200 years of history, but it's actually for 40,000 years of unbroken history. And just because the Aboriginals did not build buildings, rather than they lived with nature, with huts and everything straw, they were never considered civilized, and so they do not figure into uh, this post-colonial framework in many ways, where mostly we talk about places which were already civilized and then colonized and so on and so forth. So the amount of violence in Australia is incredible. The population was 2 crore in 1788. The population is still 2 crore. The difference is that it was 2 crore aboriginals and now it's 1.5 crore whites. And there's also the concept of stolen generation, this very beautiful film called The Rabbit Fence, if you watch, how children were picked up from Aboriginal families in the early 20th century and taken to seminaries, to churches, to educate them the British way. And so an unbroken knowledge system of 40,000 years was broken just like that within 20 to 40 years. So, which is the same case wherever the Aboriginals were colonized, whether it's in India, which is an older story, um, but let's say in US and Latin America. In India also there's something very interesting that Prathama Banerjee writes about, the idea of time that this idea of time that came from the West through Hegel and the Hegel's idea of history, uh, which I wouldn't want to go into, but basically Hegel's idea of history and time sort of made certain people inhabit history, certain people outside history. Some people would forever be marching ahead in time, some people would always be behind. And this situation will never change, like the first and the last bogie of a train. And so we are always behind in history, in the waiting room of history. And so while colonizing Calcutta and Bengal, spreading westward, while they tried to bring in these values of eight aphorisms like time is money, work is worship. So Jesus will save you. So obviously the aboriginal population of aboriginal tribal population of Jharkhand and Chhattisgarh, now Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, wouldn't understand what are they talking about. They've been worshipping somebody for thousands of years, and here there's Jesus coming to save you, or time is money. They don't know what money is or work is worship, and so they had to be literally lifted. The Santals were literally lifted from from what is now Jharkhand to areas in Assam, and which is why Assam also has Santhal population now. So this is direct displacement, like the displacement of Africans from Africa to America. And so Nandi is very correct in pointing out the innocence of this colonial enterprise. कि ये मान नहीं रहे हैं तो इनको कहीं और ले जाओ. Let's physically clear the path, so to say. So anyway, coming back to John Lang, he came to India in 1842, and he was so Australia when it was founded, it had the noblemen and the convicts. If you had stolen a spoon or even a lace, you were sentenced to death. If you were poor, if you were from the lower class, and then it was commuted to go work in Australia. And so there were these bonded people and the free people in Australia. And Lang came from the bonded people. His grandmother was a convict. And so even two generations later, there was this tension between the free people and the convicts. And so Lang was already an underdog in his own Australian situation. So when he came to India, he was quite determined to teach these British lords and ladies some lessons. So as a lawyer, he fought cases only of Indians against the British. And in a famous case of Lala Jyoti Prasad, who had supplied provisions for Anglo-Sikh wars. He won a case for him for 37 lakh rupees in 1850, which in today's money you can multiply it by 100 or 1000. I don't really know. And he was also the lawyer of Rani of Jhansi for the doctrine of lapse case. It was sort of an error of judgment on the Rani's part because the British were determined after the Lala Jyoti Prasad case to teach him a lesson. As a journalist, he constantly wrote against the British Empire and mostly about the military and the legal system. So, in his own scheme of things in 1815, you can see that he's a British man. Let's forget that he's Australian because he's a British subject, he's a white man. British man writing against the military and the judicial system um, of the time in what is not a democracy, quite openly so. So much so that Lord Hardinge summoned him and asked him like as to why he wrote against him every day. And Lang said, well, I make more money by writing against you than I ever can by writing for you. And Lord Hardinge was pleased, unlike most politicians across the world of today, and made John Lang the state guest in Shimla for a week, etc. News that he would not be able to publish in his newspaper, he would write it in Urdu. So, as a lawyer, he had to learn Persian and Urdu because those were the languages used in the lower courts. So, he would write that news piece in Urdu and drop it at the printer. The printer was the same for English and Urdu. So, there was this village that was going to be burnt down. That was burnt down by the British because they were looking for a criminal, and the village wouldn't give up the man. And so, they burned down the whole village. Now, Lang thought he wouldn't be able to write this in his own newspaper with the kind of exact details and nitty gritty he wanted to write. So he wrote it in Urdu and dropped it at the Urdu printing press, where Jami Jamshid took it up and printed it. And later, Lang himself writes about it in the third person, about a British journalist being a rogue and doing this. So these were his tricks. And he's also left clues to his method of work. As a novelist, he was, let's say, proto-feminist with very strong female characters. So, for example, there's this novel called Three Calendars, in which calendar is Kalandar, the Madam Mast Kalandar Wala Kalandar. And so when these three white men dress in the calendar dress, they look the same. And so, spoofing Jane Austen's novel, Pride and Prejudice, instead of three women falling in love with three men respectively, the same woman falls in love with all the three men. And the subsequent comedy of errors, one is packed off to India in the military for him to be able to critique the military and so on and so forth. And so his novels are not just entertaining and hilarious, they're very strongly political. And even his own understanding of India, not just criticism of British, is also very good. So, for example, he takes the issue of color and caste head on, where this white man who's a lord and who's come as a soldier, a young man, who would become a lord, being heckled by his comrades, goes on to marry a girl who's Muslim of Bishti caste and of dark black complexion. So he knew the goings on within India and he kind of flaunts it as well in his novels. And I said we'll speak about Kipling, but I forgot. And uh, in my research, my suspicion is that Kipling borrowed a lot from Lang. Kipling is almost 30 years after Lang, and especially Kim. The first half of it is completely borrowed. The story that I was telling you about this man marrying a low caste Muslim woman results in a boy with blue eyes and dark skin, and that's roughly the plot. And there are several other stories. Lang has at least 6 or 7 stories about the matter of this interracial marriage, which Kipling sort of lifts directly from there. And the second half of the novel is taken from Francis Marion Crawford's Mr. Isaacs, where there's a Buddhist monk and the Great Game, etc. And Kipling also, in terms of post-colonialism, is very interesting. In his own lifetime, uh, he was quite decimated as a writer and quite hated because of his close association with Cecil Rhodes and backing colonialism and writing openly about the white man's burden, etc. So his it's a middle age. When he was middle aged, he had become uh, quite a rambunctious imperialist. And so it's only in the postmodern times, uh, in the 60s and 70s, when critics started re-looking at things, not just for their politics, but for their design, structure, etc., that Kipling sort of was reinstated. Um, and interestingly, this kind of background is not given about Kipling when we study him in school. We study his poems like If, um, which are deeply colonial, as if they are inspirational poems, which most inspirational and self-help literature also is deeply colonial, of course. But we never told this side of Kipling, interestingly, even though between 1920 and 1970, let's say, Kipling was quite a dark character in literary uh, criticism. And so that's about John Lang, his career as a lawyer, as a journalist, as a novelist. He's a very colorful character and is completely lost to history for the last 150 years, to all the three places that he belongs. Australia, because he was fighting for the rights of convicts, so the critics at that time ignored him. Britain, obviously, was lampooning their judicial systems and legal systems. And journalists of today can take a leaf or two from John Lang's experience uh, in operating within a kingdom and not a democracy. And to India, because he's often talked about as being in the company of wine and women, and that probably does not fit the nationalistic imagination of reimagining. So thanks a lot. And if anybody has any questions, any comments, or anything to discuss, I'd be happy to discuss.
Thank you, Dr. Ranjan. Thank you, all of
Thank
you, for staying with us more than an hour now, being so patient, listeners, audience. So, thank you. We have few questions, and I'll unmute the participants who are asking these questions, and they can introduce themselves and ask the question. R. Benedetto. I'm sorry if I mispronounce your names. You can correct me. Okay. I think he's not there. Shruti, can you unmute yourself and ask the question? Yes, go ahead. Shruti, please go ahead.
Right? Maybe you can ask if she's written a question.
You're not audible, Shruti. I'm just reading your question. Sorry. Here's a question. The title of the lecture, Ghost of the Colonial Post, points towards its colonial post and not past, Shruti. I also had this confusion. The title of the lecture, The Ghost of the Colonial Post, points towards the ironical state of post coloniality, which in itself is a form of cultural imperialism and mostly a revision of Western canon, which henceforth means that coloniality is not a matter of past. What's your opinion, sir?
So from what I understand from the question, I couldn't hear it very clearly, but that um, that colonialism is replaying itself. Is that the sense that you got? Right. Okay. Um, so of course, like I said, which is why I started with cultivation and colonialism having its roots in cultivation, and that is definitely replaying its role in its very fundamental sense from cola, which is to inhabit. That if you take Coca-Cola as the symbol, that we inhabit that, and that agriculture is also being reformulated where farmers don't even have rights to seeds with GM cropping, etc. And consumerism, etc., and McDonaldization of the world is for everyone to see. So I would like to propose the term post-colonialism as opposed to post-colonialism, that the post of colonialism is here to stay in its various ghostly forms. It may not be the manifest form of military rule, but it's definitely here uh, for cultural appropriation and reappropriation.
I hope that answers your question, Shruti. Thank you, Amit. There's a question, interesting question by Amrit. He asks, Zizek says that the West has a purpose in accepting the guilt of colonizing. Is it a way to new effeminate?
Is it a way
New effeminate.
to the new effeminate?
Amrit, if you could unmute
No,
yourself.
I just asked whether it is a way to neo-effeminate, just like neo-colonialism, that is the term I'm using. So the idea is the West again trying to make the East appear childlike and not having the capability to respond back or even reach that standard where they can, write equally. And does that have
Absolutely,
something?
absolutely.
Does that
I
have
think you
something
are.
to do with?
I think you're very right, and so is Zizek. That our knowledge also, just look at it, is coming from all our knowledge is 40 years behind Western universities. We are still quoting Foucault and Derrida and Homi Bhabha and Edward Said. This is all Western academia, and our own knowledge production doesn't ever seem to catch up. We're always 30 years too behind. And of course, the West has designs in this, and there are specific designs. I think one is that in the post-colonial situation itself, that till 1950s, nobody was talking about the uh, dissolution of the nation state. So now we talk of the dissolution of the nation state, and the state as violent, as method of surveillance, as violent towards its subjects, and so on and so forth. And we have been talking about the problems of the nation ever since 1950, and which also has come from the Western academia. But look at South Asia and look at Europe. You get a Schengen visa to travel to 36 countries. And here it's becoming increasingly difficult to go to Nepal, even in Pakistan. And so the ground reality of the nation state in Europe, which has fought for 300 years its violent wars and culminated in the Second World War, now they're at peace with Christian Brotherhood. That sort of a situation cannot apply to a situation like South Asia, where the legacy of violence has been left by colonialism. So, of course, there's a Western design always in this, and in which we can go to Darwin. And Darwin is also very important to understand how dangerous Darwinism is. And so we are divided in our opinion, saying there's a social Darwin and there's a scientific Darwin, and so on and so forth. Just like there's religion is good, but religious application is bad, and similar. So what Darwin did is that from multiple gods, he reduced everything to one god. Like there could be a Chinese god, an African god, an Indian god from which we've come, but everybody now comes from Adam. There was one man in the beginning, and we have all evolved from somewhere. So while Christianity initially debunked Darwin and said that he's disproving the Adam and Eve theory, Adam and Eve have emerged. They are in sync. After the apes, the man that appeared was Adam and the African man, and that has progressed on to the European man and so on and so forth. So the possibility of multiple fathers and contesting civilizations is gone, and Australia and Africa is relegated to the backwater of history forever. So interestingly, in Darwin's own work, Descent of Man, later work, he talks about brain density. How he's calculated it, only he knew. And Darwin is this great scientist, as we invoke Darwin when we want to invoke science, where he's put everybody on a scale of 100, where you can imagine Europe is 92, Asia is 85 for being the old civilization, Australia is 88 because it's convicts, not the real whites. Africa is missing from the list. And so the whole hierarchical position that the theory of evolution puts between various races, between men and women, and this leads to systematic phrenology also, where they started studying skulls, and skulls started being traded from Tasmania and Africa to England, and the more these skulls would travel, the more their price would increase, like gold. The skulls of women are smaller, and so on and so forth. And so this design has always been there since Darwin, and Darwin is not free of guilt either. I mean, one can exempt Darwin maybe, and maybe look at his later critics as responsible, but he himself, in Descent of Man, maintains this kind of position. So it's neo-Darwinian, where there will always be a backwater of history. And currently, this is a meta discussion. We are in the backwaters of the world academia, trying to catch up with these ideas from 30 years ago.
I hope that answers your question, Amrit.
Yeah, that does. Actually, it was rather elaborate and makes very clear. Also gives other ways to think about it. So yeah, very good. Thank you.
Thanks.
We have a question from R. Benedito. He says, Hi Amit, through Nandi and Bhabha, you began to touch on the role played by the colonized within the process of colonization. Nandi perhaps more than Bhabha. Once, 1 minute. I just lost you. Nandi, perhaps more than Bhabha, considers the degree of difference amongst the colonized. How might this open up how we consider upper caste collusions with European colonizer in incohering rather than subverting colonialism in India?
Yeah, I can read it as well. Secondly, I appreciated your consideration of gender and thinking about constructions of masculinity in nationalist history, particularly in relation to Godse and Nandi, but how might feminist perspectives further trouble our understanding of nationalist processes in pointing out the continuity of patriarchy despite the end of colonialism. Thank you. So these are two questions. One, as I understand, is the collusion of the upper castes with the colonizer, which is a point very well taken, because as we know, this entire Rai Bahadur culture, um, and several other forms of culture entering the ICS, or government services, or even Tagore's own position, wherein Gore Baile sort of incites the militant nationalism, um, promoting his version of liberal nationalism. And so, of course, there has been that collusion, and which is why Ambedkar's call um, to innocently, like to invoke Nandi again, innocently leave this game altogether. And it's important to log out of systems, and he invoked logging out of all systems by embracing Buddhism on the one hand and dressing like the British on the other hand. So, despite being a hot country, he chose to dress in a suit always, and invoked his community to do the same, to log out of the Brahminical system. Um, and so, of course, this is the rupture, the mimicry that Bhabha talks about. And it's a master stroke of Ambedkar, and but for him, we'd still be suffering under a lot of problems. And the second, the feminist question that you raised is, of course, very, very important. despite the abolition of sati, there was no female subjectivity that was achieved, or all the measures that the British took. And it's only again through a rupture, through this need for mass mobilization, that the freedom fighters have had to drop their patriarchy in several ways, including Gandhi. It's very interesting that if you go to the Sabarmati ashram, there's this big printout hoarding in Gandhi's bad handwriting, saying that until the age of 54, he did not know that he wasn't the owner of his life. So he asked his Purvaji to wash the lavatory, which he refused, and everybody knows that story. That's when he realized at the age of 54, when he was already a Mahatma, that he was not the owner of his life. So it took this kind of situation for a sudden emancipation from patriarchy, where women were also on the streets and participating in the Charkha movement, also in the militant movement, staying with men, unmarried women staying with several men, and so on. So nobody really minded that because there was so much at stake. However, just after independence, it seems the women were definitely shortchanged, because while you wanted them to be shoulder to shoulder during the freedom movement, suddenly this reimagining and refashioning of the woman as Mata and repository of honor and culture and Samhita and Sanskriti post 1947 is definitely a betrayal. Um, is a betrayal to the women who participated in the freedom struggle, shoulder to shoulder, and had equal contribution, equal or even more contribution in several things. And so patriarchy knows how to reinvent itself according to a given situation and manage with these safety valves. There's no doubt.
Thank you, Amit, for that answer. Uh, Benedetto is not there with us. I think there was some network issue and he had to leave. Uh, there are many positive reviews. Bhavna says that dropped by to say hello. Dr. Ranjan, congratulations for the insightful discussion.
Hi, Bhavna. Thanks a lot.
I think she has also left. It's more than an hour now.
Yeah,
So I just like to wind it up. I'm really grateful for you to take out time for this. And
thank you so much. It was really nice. And I wish it was in real time with everybody's got the Zoom deep, but still, with whatever we can manage.
I really thank you for preparing it. I know that we could not manage much of time, but the discussion itself was very insightful, very interesting. Uh, Post-colonialism is one subject which fills me with I get bored. But today, listening to those incidents and those conversations between people, you really made it a gripping lecture. Thank you, Amit.
Thank you so
Uh,
much.
I would also like to thank all of you who are still here, patiently listening. So thank you all, and there will be many more lectures organized by Ashutosh. We have been dormant for a while, but we'll be back now. So thank you everyone. Thanks for joining.